Hello and welcome to our webinar, What Digital Transformation Means in 2018 and Beyond. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. This event will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. In addition, today's slides will be made available to all attendees. We welcome your questions for our speaker today. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #MITSMREvent. We'll answer as many questions as time permits. If you're having audio difficulties while listening via computer, please call in via telephone instead, or check the help link in the upper part of your console. Our speaker today is Didier Bonnet, Global Vice President at Capgemini Consulting and Executive Sponsor for Capgemini's Digital Transformation Program. Our thanks go out to Visagi for their sponsorship of this webinar. Didier, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and hello everyone. Delighted to be here, and what we're going to do or try to do over the next 40 minutes is really try to share with you some of the somewhat an update of a study that we did back in 2002 that led to the book Leading Digital, and it's a research that we did with the MIT originally, and we've just basically did two things. One is take a little backward look trying to understand how digital transformation has evolved in large organizations. So looking back in the last few years, and second, taking more of a forward look and really try to share with you my perspective as to where we think that digital transformation is going and what are the big trends. So let's start with, first of all, a little bit of context. I must admit that when we started the research in 2009, 2010, I remember a lot of talk around the new economy or the digital economy, and I was a little bit skeptical as to whether things were new or just adapting. I think looking back on the last few years, I've changed my mind for the reason that you can see on this slide is that I think a lot of fundamentals are changing, not overnight, but changing slowly and adapting, and it's really fundamentally changing the way that we look at competition and the way we compete. So I won't go through the whole lot, but for those who went to business school like me in the 80s or 90s, we have quite a lot of relearning to do, or even we should go back and ask for our money back, because a lot of the things that we've learned at the time have really changed when it comes to strategy and competition. So for instance, we all know that this notion of supply side linear value chain has been crumbling over the last few years. We're looking today at very connected network ecosystems, platforms, you name it, things that are much more open and much more porous in the way that we look at organization. Back in the days, we used to have very clear industry definition. We even have SIC codes, for those who remember, which were categorizing industries in a very strict format. Today, it's very blurry. So, you take companies like Amazon being the main one, is Amazon an IT company, a bookstore, a retailer, a distributor, and so on. So you have to look at competition in a very different way. And if you think about a car company, it's very hard to do strategy today because you have to open your eyes a lot wider beyond just looking at GM or BMW or Audi or whoever, but to look also at Google, Apple, and looking at smart cities and parking and congestion. So very different way of looking at what the sphere of your competitive activity is than it used to be. Loads of change in product and consumption with co-creation and the experience economy. And I think for me, one of the main one is, for those who remember Michael Porter, who pushed forward a fairly clear view that there were two ways you can get competitive advantage, which was either low cost distribution or manufacturing or differentiation. I think this is really not the case today. I mean, we're seeing a lot of newcomers who have both low cost and very differentiated offers. I think the advantage seems to be more in the ability to predict and optimize through analytics and the ability to scale. So the scale advantage is a huge competitive advantage today. And even it goes down to how we value companies. In the old days, we used to do, DCF and then asset valuation, and then we added something called goodwill, if for those who remember. And today it's impossible to do that. I mean, how do you value an Uber with the kind of asset base that they have? So a number of fundamentals are changing, and as I said, we can see it in a lot of the born digital companies like Uber and Airbnb and so on, but it's also happening to traditional industries. And I think understanding those dynamics in competition is really important if we want to understand where we believe that the economy and the digital economy is going. So that's the first point. Now, why is that important? Because it's sort of forced corporation to really look at digital transformation very seriously. And I must admit that back in the days, again, going backwards to 2010, there was a lot of awareness going on. There were firms that got it fairly quickly and other firms that were still scratching their heads as to whether digital transformation was a necessary thing or just a luxury. And I think today we've passed that stage. Every single company I meet, and I'm sure it's the same with you, you will have they will have a program or some form of digital programs running in the companies. They're still struggling with it in the main, but most of the people have passed the stage of awareness and really gone to deploy digital technology in their organizations. So let's first of all remind ourselves of some of the fundamentals that shape digital transformation. Obviously, in the original study, we came down to two key dimensions that drive what we call the DNA of digital masters. So we studied companies that have done digital transformation successfully and tried to infer what they were doing right. And it falls down to these two dimensions. One, the one on the left, the digital capabilities, what I call the what of digital transformation. It's basically making smart technology investments to either improve your customer experience or improve your operations or start changing your business model. So it's really the injection of digital technology into the organization. And by digital technology, I mean very broad definition. So it includes analytics, mobility, sensors, connected networks, and so on. So the whole shebang. But what we found at the time, which I think is also true today, is that if it were just about investing in digital technology, then the companies with the deepest pocket would actually win. And that wasn't the case. So the second dimension was equally, if not more important, was what we call the how, which is how do company actually use these technology to actually transform the organization from within. And this is more, I would say, the soft side it's all about leadership, vision, alignment, governance, and so on. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So these were the two dimensions that were driving maturity in digital transformation. And of course, in the sample we tried to classify the different level of digital mastery. And as you remember, beginners, I won't spend too much time because, as the name indicates, there are people who are not doing very many things, and there are fewer today for sure. But I still see some companies who are truly starting on the journey of digital transformation, despite the sort of 5 or 6 years of development that we've had in other organizations. Conservatives on the bottom right are companies that are doing a really good job in part of the organization, but have not managed to scale it to the rest of the corporation. So, for instance, a company like Asian Paint in Asia, which is a coating company in Asia, managed to do some fantastic work in using digital technology to get end-to-end visibility of their supply chain, but could not really scale it to the rest of the organization. It actually took a change of leadership to actually get them to be digital masters. And in the conservative area, you also find companies that are highly regulated. If you think insurance, pharmaceutical, these kind of companies who originally were sort of slowed down in their development by regulation, whether that was right or not, but at least that's the reason, excuses that they use. Or you find companies that are highly driven by what I would call the CFO mentality. So, show me the ROI, show me the ROI, show me the ROI, and then you end up doing very little. So that's the conservative. If you flip diagonally, fashionistas are completely different. Think about B2C company, sales and marketing led company. Their companies are doing 100,000 things. The strategy is, let 1,000 flower bloom and we'll see what happens. So you have initiatives everywhere, but in a very uncoordinated manner. Happens a lot in highly decentralized organization where you leave the developments at the lower level in the corporation. We find companies, we found banks, for instance, who have developed a mobile apps, 9 different mobile apps in 9 different countries under 9 different platforms and 9 different technology, and yet doing roughly the same thing. So you can see where there's a lot of duplication and loss of efficiency in that kind of model. So, and I'm not saying that any of these quadrants is bad. I think it's really important when you start your digital transformation, or you'll continue to understand where you're starting from, because depending on the start, you have different strategies. So that was that. And then, of course, the question was, okay, but if we are a digital master, what's the prize? And so we run some numbers to try to understand what was the financial impact, looking at looking at maturity assessment on one side and correlating it with real financial data on the others. And we found 2 effects. The first one was the one on the left, which is there seemed to be a revenue generation efficiency gain for those who invest more in digital technology. So that means that you can sell more with the same type of assets, which intuitively it makes sense if you think about e-commerce platform, for instance. But the numbers are small, single digit. Where it got more interesting is when we look at the profitability, and there you see that the digital masters were quite way ahead in terms of profitability. And this is, by the way, average of various industries. So we average manufacturing, average banking, average, and then average the whole lot. So the number is not so much whether it's 26 or 27, but what it means is that there's a big profitability gain in doing this program correctly. So first of all, let's turn to look at the what side, the digital capability. So the investment in digital capability. No surprises there. We saw 3 buckets where people were investing: customer experience, operations, and business model. I would say what has changed in the last few years is, whereas if we go back 5-6 years, you would have seen, I would say, 70 to 80% of the activity in the customer experience side, and maybe 15% in operations and the rest in business model. I think that's changed quite a lot today. I think we're seeing an explosion in the operations side. I would say it's about half between customer experience and operations. And this is obviously driven by technologies like IoT and AI and so on, that are providing ample opportunity to improve operation and efficiency, productivity, and so on. Business model, I would say my perspective on business model is it's a key things, because many value chains are being completely redesigned as we speak. But there's probably a lot more talk about disruption than I see action in the field, at least with my clients. So it's a very complex thing to do, to change a business model. So I think we're seeing a bit more activity today, but again, more I would say experimentation than actual change in true business model. So maybe what would be useful, Paul, at this time is to take the poll and see what you guys think has changed over the last 5 years, and then I'll share with you the result that we got from our study.
Great, Didier, thanks. So folks, you should see the first of what will be 2 poll questions appearing on your screen just about now. Please weigh in with your opinion on the first poll, and then we'll move on to the second. And don't forget to ask questions in the questions panel. Thanks, everybody. I see everyone. We got a good clip of votes there. So how would you gauge your organization's progress over the past 5 years in managing digital customer experiences? Is the question. 65% of you say it's getting better. 4% say it's getting worse. 24% say it stayed the same, and 6% don't know. Thank you. And then let's move to the second poll, and then Didier, I think you can speak to both of them at once.
Okay.
And the second poll should now be on your screen. Please weigh in. We'll take just a few seconds more. And here are the results. How would you gauge your organization's progress over the past 5 years in managing the digitization of operations? 59% say it's getting better. 5% say it's getting worse. 31% believe it stayed about the same, and 5% don't know. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you. So let me interesting. So let me give you the punchline straight away. This is what our research found, is that indeed, as you found in your own companies, we're seeing a better performance in the customer experience. So people are saying that they have better capabilities to actually fundamentally adapt to the digital customer experience. The surprising thing was more on the operations, and I think you, let me see the numbers, you said 65% improvement in customer experience, but 59% improvement in operations. So you're probably more optimistic, so your companies are better than the sample of the somewhat 800 company that we looked at, because they were actually showing a decrease in the confidence that they had digital capabilities to digitize their operations. So let's maybe analyze that a little bit to see as to what's behind the numbers. If you look at customer experience, I think you're right in the sense that I think, and this is my feeling, having interviewed many companies on that topic, is I think we've made generally progress in understanding what I would call experience design, and most companies now understand design thinking, understand how you run from an ideation process to developing a concept and eventually to an MVP or a pilot. So this is pretty well understood. I do think the whole notion of understanding customer journeys in detail and the customer data behind it is improving in most organizations. We have seen a better integration of the many channels that digital has produced over the years. Certainly, if you remember the mobile first push that happened 5-6 years ago, I think has paid dividend. I think we are seeing some pretty neat applications in the mobile channel, and it's pretty much a given today that anything that you launch is mobile instantly. And lastly, I would say that what I've seen in not all, but in a lot of organizations, is an improvement in the understanding of how you experiment and you test. And this is true for new product, new services, or new application with customers in the sense of understanding the scientific side about how you test, get the data, and correct. So quite a lot of improvement in customer experience, which probably will is a reason behind why you were optimistic and why I think the sample confirmed those views. Slightly different on the digital operation. I don't actually think it's because companies are getting worse that we're getting these data or these numbers. I think it's because the complexity of digitizing operation has become bigger. So if I remember from my work in the early days, we were doing a lot of what I would call digital re-engineering. So taking end-to-end processes and using digital technology to really improve the performance and the productivity of these processes. I think today we've moved to something which is more real-time operation, and it's all to do with a lot of the sensors that we have everywhere that produce this vast amount of data. I'll come back to that in a minute. I still think one of the biggest problem I see is this notion of integrating and managing the actual data side, and I think that's one of the bigger impediments that I see to the operation, because all these lovely technology like IoT and AI and all that do not work unless you have a good integration of your data side in the back office, and this is still a challenge for many companies. We've seen, as I mentioned, new platforms coming up, IoT. I'll come back to that in a minute. I would say that having been involved in many of these projects, they are difficult. There are still some issues around technical application issues, about standard issues, about securities, the competency that you need to actually develop that. So these are really quite difficult. We've also seen more difficulty than I anticipated in adoption of collaborative tools. I think my view on that is that people have spent too much time focusing on the technology side of the collaborative tools rather than the adoption side with the users, and that has meant that a lot of people have actually not got the benefit from that operation. And of course, on top of that, we have automation and AI appearing, and I'll come back to that. So my point is, I don't think companies are getting worse. It's just that the possibilities of digitizing operation have become enormous, but very, very complex to put into place, which explains those numbers. So now, having gone through the evolution, let's look a little bit more forward. Let me give you my perspective on having seen many cycles of digital transformation as to where I think it's all heading. And let's start maybe with the customer experience side. So as you know, consumers have become much more informed, much more involved, much more demanding over the years through the access to this digital technology. Firms themselves, as we talked about earlier on, have become much more porous, less linear, more connected, more in ecosystem type format. And this is kind of creating different dynamics in the way that firms and customer actually interact with each other. And these little pictures there, so the one on the left you'll recognize is the Mad Men era. This is where we started, which was, the power was 100% supply driven. It was the power to the corporation. We tell you what you need. We broadcast to you, the bigger the size of the marketing budget, the better. This kind of era, you remember, was what we saw where we started in the sort of pre-digital days. And then people say, hey, wait, this is changing radically because now we have social media, people have a say, they have a voice. So this kind of supply-driven model is over. Now the power has shifted 100% to the customer side, and we are becoming a very demand-driven world where customers don't not only have a voice, but they can share it at scale. Okay, and that was a kind of the sort of few years that we've lived in, or the decade that we've lived recently. And then more recently, people say, oh, wait again, now the quants appeared. And we said, now with data analytics, it's great because we can predict stuff. We can infer what you need. We can sort of figure out what you will need next. So the kind of power is shifting back to large corporation. Okay, so you had this kind of wave of who controls this kind of customer experience. And our view, because this is a piece of research we've done with René Gosselin at the MIT, our view was the truth is that the locus of control of the customer experience in the digital age is increasingly neither in the hands of the firm nor in the customer. It is actually shared. It is a negotiated, what we call collaborative exchange. And I'll explain that in more detail. There are two things that are happening. The customer experience has become a kind of a two-sided collaborative market in a way. And what digital technology has done is provide the platform to accelerate this collaboration. So let me explain the two sides thing. It's based on increasingly the participation of customers in what you do as businesses. So for instance, think about a self-service. Think about you going to an airport and printing your own ticket and printing your own luggage tags and so on. So the firm provides more access and more transparency, and that's what we call the participation market. And obviously for the firm it has advantage because you increase innovation, you reduce cost, you reduce resource intensity in terms of people, and you reduce risk because you have a lot more data about what the customer is actually doing. So that's on the firm side. On the consumer side, it's more about information flows. So customers are providing information about themselves at every single touch point in an organization, and there's a real information market happening where we're asking consumers to share more and more information for all good reasons like loyalty, personalization, and so on. But it's also based on the customer being willing to share that data. And in order to understand the willingness of customer to share data, you have to understand what is a customer, what we call the customer capital. So in other words, what are they getting in return for sharing the data with you? And this customer capital can be economic, money, non-cash rewards, so on. It can be cultural, like self-expression, think about Pinterest and others. It can be social, about status, networks, reputation, or it can be informational, helping you to make a better decision for information. And of course, more touch points, the more we have touch points, the more we have data flows. And this interplay is really crucial to design the customer experience in the future, because as we said, it's a negotiated interplay between a firm allowing you to participate and the willing collection of data. So let me just, I won't go through the whole thing, but you get the picture. It's at every point in the value chain of the company, you can have this interaction at play, whether it's at the R&D for co-creation or at the customer service. So for instance, if you take in the logistics side, if you take UPS, they cracked very simply a very problematic things. Customer wanted to know exactly when their parcel will be delivered. And they used to call a call center, which didn't have the answer, but the answer was inside the firm. It was in one of the system where, because they can geolocate the vans, they know exactly. And when I say exactly, it's not between 2:30 and 3:30, it's 2:38. They can work out exactly at what time the van will be in front of your door, so your parcel will be delivered. So the trick in the participation was, how do we give access to this data to consumers? And that's what they've done with the UPS parcel My Choice. And by doing that, you solve a two-sided equation. You please customers because customers are getting the answers, and you give them access so they don't call your call center. They actually go straight to the site and get the data. So you get the idea. Is this notion of I'm willing to give you data if I participate and if I get benefits in return. And that collaborative exchange is really essential in the design of future customer experience, but it has a somewhat scary side. It means that the firm has to abdicate some control of their value chain to help you to participate, and customers have to abdicate some control of their data. Okay, so that's a kind of a deal that happened. And the way that you design this new customer experience is really to try to understand two sides. First of all, how do you share the participation or not, which is a vertical axis there. So, do I open my value chain to customer participation or not, which is a decision, and do I gather a lot of information, and then how do I leverage the information? So information gathered can be because customer gives it to you, or because you can get it from somewhere else. So for instance, if I don't want to give my date of birth to someone, they can probably get it through Facebook or something like that. So you amass customer information. Now, as you see, there's no right and wrong in this thing. It's just a strategy. So if you take a company like Quaise, obviously highly participative, encouraging people to drop into their value chain and provide information and sharing data. At the same time, consumer is very happy to give data because they get a better service in return. So this is what we call the perfect equilibrium, where you've got both sides actually being quite willing to share with each other because they both see the benefits. Whereas if you take a company like Amex, different type of positioning. So whereas Waze is more about promoting connections and community building and community sharing, Amex is about necessity. So Amex is there's not a lot of participation in doing transaction with Amex because they promote reliance, security, and therefore have to control their system a little bit better. Like Disney, for instance, in the other example, somewhat controls the customer experience, but nevertheless gets a lot of data from customer, from the band and other tools. So again, there's no right or wrong in how you design these experiences. I think the key thing is that consumer, and the paradox is that consumers are willing to do a lot of the work that company used to do, and it makes them more happy. So I think as you look at your customer experience in the future, it's very important to look at where are the significant benefits that I can gain from running this kind of pilot. And sometimes it can be driven by customer pain points. So can we solve that by making our value chain more participative and encouraging customers to do that, like a self-service application? Sometimes it can be proactive by actually starting new touch points, which a lot of companies have done to try to encourage customer to participate, because we know that increase customer satisfaction. So So think about this notion of participation and information leverage. And by the way, you can get it easily wrong, because if you ask the consumer to give you a lot of information and they get nothing in return, then it has a negative effect. So the sentiment will be negative at that point. So really important to understand this notion and this concept. So that's the way that I see the consumer experience evolving is much more with this kind of sharing of data in order to provide new and better and more personalized services, and at the same time consumer participating a lot more in the activities of your value chain. Okay, and that's for customer experience. Let's now move on to look a little bit at what's happening in the more business operation side, and there I think what we're seeing is this notion of a new model of distributed intelligence, for lack of a better word, where the machine through AI and automation is taking or playing a bigger role in the operations of your organization. So we've mentioned it already. The first thing that's happened is the IoT wave, and the reason I'm excited about IoT, it's the first time in my career where we are getting real-time information from the point of usage. Because we've slapped sensors everywhere, so we know how our people are using services and products. We know how often, we know when, so you're getting this ton of data in real time, and if you have the capability to analyze it, it gives you an incredible advantage to for the first time really understand usage as it happens from consumers. We are in the development phase, I would say, of this kind of technology. As I mentioned earlier on, it's highly complex to put into place, because you have a capture layer where you control the data through sensors and stuff like that. You have a communication layer where you have to pump this information to your company, and then you have obviously the analytical side, which is incredibly complex, and then it loops back. So these things are quite complex because there are loads of security issues, as I've mentioned. But a lot of companies are making big progress. If you think about areas like predictive maintenance, I think we're seeing some pretty big business case being built around this kind of technology, and I think as we solve the security and particularly the standard issues, I think we'll see more of that. The key, I would say, from a business side is, although we can slap sensors on everything today because the cost of sensors has gone down tremendously, I think is to think very early on about the business model and the monetization. So yes, you can slap a sensor on your toothbrush, for instance, that will tell you how you brush your teeth every morning, for how long, and whether you're doing it right or not. But would you pay more for that service is a key question. And I think you have to start with this kind of business model type concept in order to find the right application for this kind of technology. But this is happening now, as I said, development stage, but we'll see a lot of activities going forward in the next 3 to 5 years. Second thing that's happening now is we have seen the cost of industrial robots declining extremely fast over the last few years. The two curves you see are two estimates that were made by two different companies a few years back that kind of say, okay, around that period, a robot will go down to about $30,000. In fact, I've given you an example of Baxter from Rethink Robotics in Boston, who are actually selling Baxter at the standard price of $22,000. So you can see how the cost curve has gone down, allowing and making economic application of these type of robots. And the second thing that I think for me is more important is the flexibility has increased. So Baxter, for instance, is what's called a humanoid robot. You can put it on a production line next to workers. He'll stop working if you get too close to him or her. He will talk to you. It doesn't need programming. You actually take the hand and you can reset how it looks at things. So you think about applications like quality assurance of certain parts, incredibly cost effective. So we're seeing a lot of changes how we run our factories and how we really change the whole notion of industrial robotics in our corporation. And the interesting thing is you'd think, okay, so the guys that are going to go down that route are the companies that lived in countries where the cost of labor is really high, and yet that's not what we're seeing. I mean, China is the #1 buyer of robotics today, and it's a country where obviously labor costs are a lot lower than in the United States. So we're seeing that expanding, and obviously it is changing the nature of how we run our factories. So that's definitely happening and has been happening for quite a while already. Of course, the next thing that everyone's talks about today is AI. And AI, we've seen some amazing performance improvements in the actual performance of this technology. So here's an example about speech recognition based on a sample that is part of the 100-year research that Stanford is doing with a number of other universities. And you can see, amazingly, that we have now reached the point where machines are actually on par with human to recognize voice, which obviously drives a gazillion application in things like customer service assistance and others. And it's getting better, and it will get better. And it's already driving a number of product success. So the most obvious one, obviously, is Echo, or I could have taken it. Now we have an Apple version, a Google version, and so on. But what's amazing with Echo is not so much the install base; it's a number of skills that this thing can do. And skills is basically application that you can do. If you think about, I mean, I got an Echo as soon as it came out because I thought it was genius technology. But when it came out, if I look at my behavior, I was basically mainly playing music or asking silly questions and that kind of stuff. But now the skills and the capability is amazing. You can buy pizzas, you can order your Uber. My wife is a math teacher, and she actually used Echo as a teaching model for students. Asking questions. So, amazing array of applications. And what that does is we're getting used as individuals to have this voice connection as an interface between us and the machine. And we're seeing already this kind of technology being applied inside cars, for instance, because this voice interface, I think, is becoming more common, and it's obviously, a natural language for human beings. So we'll see a massive explosion. And again, we are somewhat at the beginning with this kind of products of what this technology can do. If I move to visual object detection, same thing, and even better. Now the machines are actually better than humans at recognizing images, and this is leading now to quite some amazing application. And I will take one example, which is medical imaging. I have one of my friends who's doing a big experiment right now. He's a radiologist, and he says to me, I used to spend 8 hours a day having to make assessments based on image, radiology image, and this assessment were every 10 seconds virtually. So extremely tiring, extremely demanding for a radiologist to get this concentration for the whole of 8 hours on all these kind of images. Now machines can do that. So what he's saying is his job has now kind of changed because he's getting to some extent a first diagnostic from the machines, and it allows him to really focus on the detailed diagnostics for the patients. So real big improvement. And I've taken a medical examples, but I can find plenty of others where this image recognition, of course, there are examples with face recognition, for instance, which if you think about retail and things like VIP shoppers, for instance, in luxury retail, face recognition can have amazing impacts in terms of the customer experience. It can also present some danger for people information, as we know, which is obviously another topic, but I think which is really important. But these technologies are amazingly improving exponentially and will continue to do so over the next few years. We are really in there at the beginning of what we are going to see in the future. And in fact, and I've taken here a banking example, but it could be any others. I think what's happening is technologies like AI and machine learning in particular are kind of what economists used to call general purpose technology. You can apply them very widely in a number of areas. So in this example of banking, it's not just the back office where you automate processes or you automate whether it's a basic process or cognitive process, but it goes to the front end where you can have chatbots and personal vocal assistants and all sorts of things, and then you get analytics at the back end of that. So what it's doing is really putting some intelligence, this is why I called it distributed intelligence, inside the organization. And I think what we're going to see is it's going to force to change the shape of our organization. So in other words, it's not a single application that's going to be very transformative. It's once you introduce all of these scientific and tools and intelligence into the organization, it's going to force you to do three slightly different transformations. Let me give you my perspective on that. The first one is obviously the technology transformation. It's about technology innovation. So how do we use this new lever for efficiency and innovation? Okay, and as you see in this example, there are plenty of opportunities to do that in most industry. The second transformation is more people and human oriented. It's really about what I would call social innovation. It will fundamentally change the way that we work inside an organization, and I think it will require quite a massive workforce transition in terms of reskilling. And most of my clients are really worried about this topic today, because mass reskilling is not something that large corporations are great at doing today. So we need to figure out how we can do that, so we get the workforce to move with us as we develop this amazing technology. And then the last one I can see happening, but maybe in a slightly longer term, but it's already starting, is what I would call an organizational transformation. We need to inject organizational innovation, because what's happening with distributed intelligence is we have to rethink the kind of model of organization that we've developed somewhat 100 years ago, based on military principle with top-down communication and very rigid silos, because our organization will become more scientific. They are becoming already today more transparent because of all this digital technology. They're becoming more cross-functional, and eventually, I think through some of the things that we're doing today, I think it will become more self-organizing, and that's the whole promise of agile and all this kind of thing. As I say, we're not there yet. It's an evolution, but this is a big change that I see coming going forward. So let's now look at how the two sides of the matrix have evolved over time, and if the what and the how, and if you remember the matrix, the what was about digital capabilities and the how about leadership capabilities. No change on the what. So I think people are about 40% of people are basically saying, yes, we believe that we have the required capability to understand and introduce digital technology inside our organization. More surprisingly, the how seems to be difficult. And you see a drop there, a big drop, 10%, about people thinking that they have the leadership capability, the soft side I mentioned earlier on, to actually do a successful digital transformation. So let me maybe comment first about what these are. And I think if you remember, the how was really around creating a vision about why are you doing this, what is a driving theme or the guiding principles for doing this digital transformation. It was all about engagement and culture. So engagement is nothing new in transformation, but with digital transformation, what's new is that you can do it at scale. So can we engage our entire population in terms of what we're in terms of the purpose of this digital transformation? It was also about governance, which is a slightly boring topic, but an extremely important one, because for what I've just said about organization, because we've designed the organization a long time ago, they're very siloed. There's a lot of legacy behavior in those organizations, and the problem with digital is it cuts right across it. So it forces multifunctionality in terms of the teams that you create. It needs creative people, IT people, supply chain people, marketing people working together, and this is not natural for a large organization. So it forces sharing and coordination, and that's why governance is required. And lastly, it was all about technology and business integration. You all heard the story about the two-speed IT and how we can work differently in digital. I think we made a lot of progress in that. People I think are somewhat getting that digital development is slightly different than the legacy development we used to do, but there's still a lot of difficulty getting this integration done. Some of the best company I've seen actually seen huge progress in both the marketing people, for instance, getting much more technology aware, and vice versa, the technology people getting much more business aware. So that's big progress. And I would say what's changed since 2002 is I would add a big bubble in the middle, which is this whole notion of capability and workforce enablement, because what I've seen is that is still today one of the biggest impediments to getting the work done is how do we skill up the organization? And you can't just hire everyone. You actually need to reskill part of the people that you have, and that seemed to be an area of struggle for corporations. So let me finish and tell you why I think people are struggling with digital capability generally. I think they're probably, in my view, is that people back in 2002 are probably slightly over optimistic because they were starting their digital transformation to some extent. So probably underplaying how difficult it was going to be, particularly on the people side. And I think what happened then is the excitement was more around the technology or the digital technology in digital transformation rather than the transformation itself. And I think that has reverted now because people realize that the transformation is probably equally important, if not more. And despite all this tech progress, I think what we're seeing today is that the talent and competency gap is still big and probably getting bigger in organizations. So this notion of I mentioned earlier about how do we actually bring people with us with a whole notion of reskilling the organization, which is a complex thing to do, is becoming really important. We have started to break down silo, but it's still a struggle in many organizations between the business and the technology side. So we probably need to continue to find other models to actually run that effectively. And lastly, what I call employee-wide engagement is still the exception to some extent, or still in minority. So people are still finding it hard to translate what they're doing in digital transformation to something meaningful to the front-end employees, the people that are in the front line. In addition, what I would say is that the expectations are rising all the time. So every time if you take an example of taxis or something, the best taxi app has become the de facto norm today. So you're always measured towards the best, and that's raising the bar constantly in terms of how you deliver your customer experience or your operation. And the last one I would make is it seems we talk a lot about digital culture, and it's a very difficult thing to narrow down because it's quite a nebulous concept. But as much as we can measure it, as you see in this data, only about a third of organizations seem to be adapting their organization to a more digital culture in terms of decision making based on data, in terms of promoting exploration and experimentation and so on. So still and this is a leadership thing. And I know back in 2012 we mentioned leadership a lot, and I think I would say it's still true today. So what I think is going on is that the technological progress is still well in advance of our ability to adapt our organization, and we knew that then, and we know that now. So we're moving faster as slower as organization than the technological progress. And but some companies are making real headways, and I think my fear, and I conclude on that, my fear is that we will see probably a polarization over time between organizations who have managed to really integrate this technology effectively, retrain their people, and really get a constant flow so the next wave of technology doesn't scare them because they kind of have the processes to experiment and roll out and scale. And those companies that are still really struggling or even starting, that in my view face the danger of really being left behind. So Paul, I'll conclude on that if we want to move to questions.
Didier, thank you very much. Let's move into questions, as we have many, many questions, and they span a kind of a gamut of interests. And folks, I'm going to do my best to identify the themes that kind of came up most frequently. And you can continue to ask questions during this part of the session, either using the questions module on your screen or on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMR event. So Didier, let's dive in. A number of people are interested in hearing your take on privacy concerns. Both, we've got new regulation, and I think we just have a growing concern over how the data we've already shared is being used. You cite customers' willingness to share information about themselves as a key driver of growth. What are the risks there?
So good question. It's a massive debate. Let me tell you my take. So first, when it comes to data privacy and transparency, I am a strong believer that if not for us, we owe it to our kids to get some clarity about what's going on right now, because half of the people, and when I say half, it's probably more, around the world, do not understand how their data is being used by some of these new platforms in particular, and that's, to me, is not right. So we need, and I think the current European regulation that happened a few weeks back is a good way forward. It will have, both positive and some negative implication, but it's a good way forward. And I would say, beyond governmental regulation, I would really encourage industry type regulation. So let me explain. I think it would be highly valued by customers for certain industry to have a common view on, and therefore declaration of, how we collect your data and how we use your data, a very transparent way, because it takes governments forever to come up with regulation facing with such pace of technology. And I would say something that may sound provocative, but I am not in favor of putting regulation before innovation. So in other words, I am 100% convinced that despite some of the problems we have today, I would rather see innovation happens first and regulation second. I would probably make an exception today because we've gone too far on the personal data and privacy for the reason that I just explained. But I think, so that needs to be tackled either at the government level or either at the company level. There are still things that, I suffer from that as much as anything, because when, I see my friends being tagged without my authorization, it really annoys me. So there's plenty of these things that are happening in the background that we have to be much more transparent about, in order for customers to make their own judgment whether they're willing to share information or not. And I think I emphasized that in my spiel about customer experience. It is a negotiated deal, so they want to see something in return, but they also want to see something that is transparent and they can understand.
Thank you. Let's talk for a minute about the board's role in digital transformation. It seems like boards today are more likely to be drags on transformation than they are assets to transformation. Is that accurate? And if that is the case, who's responsible for getting the board on board?
I'm not sure that's accurate. I would have said that's. I remember writing a paper back to 2012 about the role of boards, because at the time, the boards were pretty unaware of what this wave of transformation was going to happen. I think things have changed, to be honest, and we went through a wave where the trick was about to put somebody who's tech savvy on the board. I don't know if you remember, but there was the recruitment agents built entire practices on recruiting smart tech savvy people so we could put them on board. I don't think that's sufficient. I think it's more about awareness, and I think some of the board I see today are much more aware of what's going on in digital transformation, because they've all been to California, they've all talked to the 4 or 5 companies in their industries that are more forward in transformation. So I would say that the board the board awareness has increased quite substantially. We're not there yet. There are still some very traditional boards that probably would need some education, but it has improved. Second point is the financial markets are pushing. So it's not just sufficient that the management board influences the company board, but I think financial markets are pushing, because if you're doing nothing or not a lot, you will get the questions from the market about what are you doing in digital transformation, particularly if you're in an industry where digital is kind of reshaping the boundaries of competition. Let's take retail, for instance, today, where if you're a retailer, you're squeezed between the low-cost player and the Amazon of this world. The board, if the board doesn't ask the question, then the financial market will, about how you're protecting your future survival by transforming yourself digitally.
So let's talk about leadership outside of the board, both kind of in the C-suite and then in key leadership positions that are not at the top level. How does an organization go about kind of assessing their leadership readiness, their leadership skills with respect to digital transformation. I think a key question is, who can we train, and where do we need new blood?
It's a very good and very complex question. So we have made, again, if I look over the last few years, I think we have made progress at understanding what are some of the characteristics of digital leadership that are different from just leadership. Okay, so there are characteristics for about how you assess leadership that, to be honest, have stayed constant for the last decades, and those are still good. There are, however, new one about, for instance, this notion of creating and fostering entrepreneurship within large organization and managing cross-functional teams, for instance, which is not which is fairly new to the kind of leadership that we need today. So this, so if you think about the sort of command and control model that we had before, with middle management being the main conduit for instruction and reporting, I think it's a different type of leadership when you have to lead a multitude of to some extent self-managing teams which are very cross-functional, with a start and an end, and then they'll go back and do something else. So there are new traits of leadership that we're getting better at understanding, and there are a few assessments out there for those who are interested that I can share with you, where we define sort of what are the leadership traits of these people. The question then, the second question you ask is the most difficult one, is how do you train for this? So yes, you can, so there are areas where you just have to hire, because the kind of leadership that you're requiring is probably is very specific. So if you think about certain technical area, for instance, you may want to have standard leadership traits, but you also want to have some very specific technical knowledge, and that you don't have. So think about somebody leading your analytics team. So if it's something that you don't have, you're leading a bunch of data scientists is very different than leading a bunch of sales guys. So those are things that you may need to hire from the outside. I still remain a fundamental believer that there's a lot of things that you can retrain with people, but that the current way that we train people is probably not the right one. So in other words, I think the whole leadership and development community ought to look at standard classroom training and all this kind of stuff, and go back to much more experiential training, apprenticeship coaching and all this kind of stuff that I think seems to work better certainly in some of the organizations I've seen that are spending time trying to retrain their people.
Very good, thank you. Let's talk about co-creation for a moment. The need or the imperative to involve your customers as co-creators of products feels like one of those things that might be more hype than reality. Is that risk there?
Yeah, well, it's probably fair question, I think, because there's been when the whole open innovation started, 10, 15 years ago, whenever, there was a lot of talk about co-creation. We're going to co-create with our customers, and when you look at the detail and say, okay, so what have you co-created with your customers? There was not a lot to talk about, and the reason, I think, is because co-creation involves not just the notion that you're going to co-create with your customers, but the infrastructure that's needed to make that happen on a constant basis. So how do you get your voice of your customer? It's not just about, we designed this and then we tested it with this customer, therefore we've co-created. That's not how it works. It's more about the constant feedback that you need to get from your customers in order to really understand what they need and how they can influence the design. And that is a very hard thing to do. In some cases, people are also a bit scared of co-creation, because when you co-create your customer, you're opening the inside of your organization, basically, and they have competitive fears that the information may flow to their competitors. But I think I've seen corporations putting this kind of infrastructure in place, and so an example would be like if you take a Netflix, for instance. I think they are co-creating constantly because they're getting all the data and I provide a lot of data to Netflix because I get a lot of customer capital back from what I view. And so this, but they have the infrastructure to do that through the data. I think it's either physical or database. You need to build the infrastructure where you can make that happen. It's not what I'm seeing today, to be honest, is a lot of, oh, we've invited a lot of customers to come and do an hackathon with us, and that's co-creation. But then, yes, it is. But when I see the actual results, it's a lot less impressive than the hackathon itself, if you see what I mean.
Yes, and thank you. That's a really important point of differentiation, the kind of active co-creation versus passive co-creation, right? What you describe in Netflix is passive co-creation, but it's only enabled because Netflix saw the value in gathering that information.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Great. So we have, I think we have time for one more question. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to weave together a whole bunch of issues that you raised and that the audience has reacted to, and kind of ask you to end on an optimistic note, if you will. So we've got in 6 years, since that's the timeline we looked at in your study, complexity is increasing. I think the just simple awareness of the size of the challenge of digital transformation has really taken hold. And as you pointed out towards the end of your presentation, technology innovation is a moving target. Every time we're catching up, the goalposts move ahead. We've wrapped our heads around big data, and now big data is turning into to AI. So, where does this leave us? If for every 5 steps of progress, we're actually ending up 7 steps behind, how do we keep an optimistic point of view?
So let me say up front that I was, what I would call a digital optimist back in 2009, 2010, and I still am. I think what I've come to realize is that I was a little bit naive back then, because I thought, we have to get our organization to keep pace with technology on a par, if you will. So at the same rate of technology development, we need to develop our organization. I think I've become a bit more realistic to say we will never be at the same level of where the technology is. So we will always be in a situation where we're a little bit behind or far behind where the technology is taking us. But that's okay, as long as we know that we can ingest this technology for business purposes because we've done it before. So it's a little bit like a marathon. You don't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to run a marathon. You start deciding that this is your goal, and then you do 5K, 10K, 20K, whatever. I think it's the same with that. The companies that are going through more and more cycles, learning from their successes, but also their mistakes, are adjusting their organization. And therefore, even if it's really painful because we've just solved the data problem, so we now have data flows that make sense and it's integrated in our corporation, and boom, arrives machine learning, and we go, oh my God, this is another set of initiatives that I have to launch to do that. I think that these companies are actually much more relaxed than that, because they know they've been there before. They know what they have to do to test, what they have to do to come up with the right application, the right strategy, and then what they have to do to scale something that goes success. The problem is with a company that have not gone through a lot of these cycles, because I think for them, if you leave the technology, go as it will run forward at the pace it is running forward today, it's going to be a huge mountain to climb to catch up. And that's why I mentioned polarization at the end of my speech. Is I think I'm seeing, at least from the large companies I talk to, I'm seeing this happening as we speak today.
Didier, thank you very much. I think we can call that an optimistic word of caution and encouragement, and a great way to end this presentation. Thank you very much, and to our audience, thank you very much. The questions were outstanding and plentiful, and I apologize we could only get to a handful. Over the next few days, please look for a feedback survey we'll be sending via email, and we'd greatly appreciate your thoughts and opinions on today's program. And a reminder that a recording of this program, along with the slides, will be available within 3 to 4 business days. That concludes our program for today. Thank you for attending. Thank you to our terrific presenter, Didier Bonnet, and thanks to our sponsor, BizAgi. Have a great day.